In the heart of a bustling city precinct, a story of power, corruption, and divine justice is about to unfold. When a group of jaded officers mistake Father Michael O'Malley's quiet demeanor for weakness, they decide to make an example of him. For years, these officers had ruled their district through intimidation and casual brutality, their badges serving as shields against consequence. But this time, they've made a grave miscalculation. What appears to be a simple priest in there, holding cell, is actually a man with connections that reach across continents and into the highest chambers of the Catholic Church. This isn't just another tale of police misconduct. This is the story of how a humble servant of God would bring an entire corrupt precinct to its knees, armed with nothing but faith, truth, and the full diplomatic weight of the Vatican City State. What follows is an account of how these officers learned that true authority doesn't come from a badge or a gun, but from a power higher than any earthly institution. The morning light filtered through the stained glass windows of St. Augustine's Church, casting rainbow-colored shadows across Father Michael O'Malley's weathered journal as he made his daily entries. His handwriting, neat but showing signs of age, filled page after page with the stories of his community, their struggles, their triumphs, and their endless capacity for redemption. At 63, Father O'Malley carried himself with the quiet dignity of a man who had spent decades in service to others. His silver hair, always neatly trimmed, and his worn but well-maintained black clothes spoke of a man who took pride in his appearance without vanity. The slight stoop in his shoulders came not from age, but from countless hours spent listening to troubled souls in the confessional, serving soup in the church's kitchen, and kneeling in prayer beside hospital beds. The leather-bound journal resting on his desk told the story of 20 years in this parish. Each entry reflected the deep connections he had forged in this corner of the city, where poverty and hope lived side by side. Today's entry detailed his latest success, young Marcus Thompson, a former gang member who had just earned his GED through the church's education program. Another soul finding its way, O'Malley whispered, closing the journal with reverence. The book's pages were thick with inserted letters, photographs, and small mementos, each one a testament to lives touched and changed. The church's basement hummed with activity as O'Malley descended the worn stone steps. The rehabilitation program he'd started 5 years ago had grown from a handful of desperate people to a beacon of hope in the community. Ex-convicts learned trade skills alongside recovering addicts, while volunteers from local businesses taught computer literacy and job interview techniques. "Morning, Father Mike," called out Rosa Martinez, a grandmother who had transformed herself from a former drug addict into one of the program's most dedicated volunteers. Her smile carried the warmth of personal redemption. "Good morning, Rosa. How's the new computer class coming along?" O'Malley's voice was soft, but carried clearly. A tone developed through years of earning trust rather than demanding attention. "Full house today, Father. Even got 3 new students from the halfway house on Cedar Street." Rosa beamed with pride, her own journey giving hope to others still finding their way. The morning progressed with its usual rhythm: counseling, sessions, program coordination, and the quiet work of helping people rebuild their lives. O'Malley moved through it all with patient determination, his presence a stabilizing force in a community that had known too much chaos. In his office, between meetings, he paused to add another note to his journal. A photograph slipped out. A group shot from last year's Christmas celebration, showing faces bright with hope where despair had once resided. These were his people, his flock in the truest sense, not just those who attended Sunday Mass, but anyone who sought a path to better days. The afternoon brought Jimmy Keller to his door, a teenager with angry eyes and clenched fists. O'Malley had been watching him for weeks, noting his increasing involvement with local gangs. Without a word, he opened his office door and gestured to the chair across from his desk. "Didn't come here for a sermon, Father," Jimmy muttered, but sat anyway. "Good," O'Malley replied simply. "I'm not offering one." He opened his journal, turning to a photograph from 15 years ago. "Though I would like to tell you about another young man who once sat in that same chair, wearing that same anger." Jimmy's eyes flickered with interest despite himself as O'Malley began to share the story of redemption, one of countless tales preserved in the pages of his journal. This was how change happened, not through grand gestures or forceful interventions, but through quiet moments of connection, through stories shared and trust earned. As evening approached, O'Malley stood at the church steps, watching his neighborhood prepare for night. The streets here weren't the safest, but his presence had helped carve out a space where hope could take root. His journal, safely stored in his office, held the evidence of what was possible when someone believed in the power of second chances. What he didn't record in those pages was the growing tension with local law enforcement. He'd seen the patrol cars circling more frequently, watched the aggressive stops of young men who'd done nothing wrong. O'Malley had raised concerns through proper channels, written letters to the precinct captain, even spoken at community meetings, but he never wrote about the threats, the warnings to mind his own business, the increasing hostility from certain officers who saw his work as interference. Instead, his journal focused on the light he saw in every soul that crossed his path, the potential for goodness that existed even in the darkest places. It was this unwavering belief in redemption that would soon be tested in ways he could not yet imagine. Sergeant James Morrison slammed the thick manila folder onto his desk, sending a cascade of complaint forms fluttering to the floor of the precinct's back office. Each paper represented another concerned citizen whining about his team's methods. His lips curled into a sneer as he picked up the latest edition, a formal complaint about excessive force during a routine stop, complete with witness statements and photographs. "Another one for the circular file," he muttered, feeding the document into the shredder beside his desk. The mechanical whir briefly drowned out the bustling sounds of the precinct beyond his door. Morrison had spent 15 years building his little empire within the 43rd precinct. What bleeding hearts called corruption, he called efficiency. What do-gooders labeled brutality, he considered necessary enforcement. His team, Officers Reynolds, Diaz, and Thompson, understood this perfectly. They were his hand-picked crew, carefully selected for their willingness to follow his lead and share his view of law enforcement. "Sarge," Officer Reynolds appeared in the doorway, his broad frame filling the space. "Got another complaint coming in. That priest from St. Augustine's again." Morrison's jaw tightened. Father O'Malley had become an increasing irritant over the past few months, documenting their activities, encouraging residents to file formal complaints, speaking up at community meetings. The priest's quiet persistence was starting to draw unwanted attention from internal affairs. "Let me guess, more accusations about our treatment of his precious rehabilitation cases?" Morrison's voice dripped with contempt. He pulled up the internal affairs database on his computer, navigating to a folder labeled Community Complaints. With a few keystrokes, he buried O'Malley's latest report in a maze of digital bureaucracy. "He's got documentation this time, Sarge. Photos of Thompson rough-handling that kid from the halfway house." Reynolds shifted uncomfortably. Even he seemed uncertain about how far things had gone. "Documentation can disappear, Reynolds. Remember that." Morrison stood, straightening his badge. "Besides, who's going to believe a bunch of ex-cons over decorated officers?" The system they'd built was perfect in its simplicity. Complaints vanished into administrative black holes. Witness statements were lost or discredited. Evidence became misplaced. Meanwhile, their arrest numbers stayed high, keeping the brass happy and ensuring their methods went unquestioned. Out in the main office, Officers Diaz and Thompson were processing another group of young men, all picked up on questionable charges. The fear in the suspects' eyes was exactly what Morrison wanted to see. Fear meant control, and control meant power. "Your priest friend is going to be a problem," Diaz said later, during their nightly meeting in Morrison's office. The four officers had gathered to discuss their growing O'Malley situation. "He's not backing down like the others." Morrison leaned back in his chair, studying the collection of commendations on his wall. Each plaque and certificate had been earned through his particular brand of law enforcement. Then maybe it's time we taught him the same lesson we teach everyone else who doesn't know their place. He's a priest, Sarge, Reynolds protested weakly. That's different than some street punk. The evening air carried a hint of autumn chill as Father O'Malley locked up the church's community center. Jimmy Keller, the troubled teen from earlier that week, had finally opened up during their evening counseling session. Progress, however, small, was worth celebrating. The priest's footsteps echoed off brick walls as he made his way through the poorly lit parking lot. He heard the patrol car before he saw it, the low rumble of an engine deliberately held at idle. Sergeant Morrison's vehicle crept around the corner, headlights off, followed by a second cruiser. Well, well, look who's out past curfew. Morrison's voice carried across the empty lot as he stepped from his vehicle. Officers Reynolds and Thompson flanked him, while Diaz circled behind O'Malley, cutting off his retreat. Good evening, Sergeant. O'Malley's voice remained steady, his hands visible at his sides. The community center runs evening programs. You know this. Heard some interesting reports about your programs, Father. Morrison moved closer, his badge catching the dim streetlight. Word is you're harboring known criminals, interfering with police business. Rehabilitation isn't interference, Sergeant. These people are trying to rebuild their lives. Sure they are. Morrison nodded to Thompson, who began roughly searching O'Malley's pockets. And I'm sure you won't mind us checking for any illegal substances. Gang members, addicts, you never know what might rub off. The security camera above the community center's door whirred quietly, its red light steady in the darkness. O'Malley had installed it after the first round of police harassment, though Morrison and his team seemed not to notice or care. Nothing. Here, Sarge, Thompson reported, stepping back. Just his phone and some papers. Morrison snatched the phone, scrolling through it with deliberate slowness. Well, what's this? Looks like correspondence with known felons. Planning some sort of gathering, are we? Those are confirmation emails for tomorrow's job training seminar, O'Malley replied calmly. All properly registered with the parole board. That's not how I read it. Morrison's smile turned predatory. Looks more like conspiracy to me, planning to interfere with law enforcement, harboring fugitives, maybe even aiding and abetting. You know that's not true, Sergeant. Do I? Morrison stepped closer, his breath hot with threat. What I know is you've been a thorn in my side for too long, always showing up at community meetings, encouraging complaints, sticking your collar where it doesn't belong. The first shove came from behind, Diaz pushing O'Malley forward into Thompson's waiting grip. The priest stumbled, but didn't resist, as his arms were roughly pulled behind his back. You're making a mistake, O'Malley said quietly. No, Father, you made the mistake. Morrison watched with satisfaction as Thompson cinched the handcuffs tight enough to bite. You forgot the natural order of things. We're the law here, not your precious rehabilitation programs or community complaints. The booking photo captured everything. The calm dignity in O'Malley's eyes, the beginning of bruises where the cuffs had been deliberately over-tightened, the slight dishevelment of his collar from the rough handling. What it couldn't capture was the steady rhythm of his prayers as he was processed, or the weight of centuries of church authority that was about to descend upon the 43rd Precinct. Book him for conspiracy and resisting arrest, Morrison ordered the desk sergeant, who looked uncertain but didn't dare object. Let him spend the night getting to know the other side of the law. As they led him to the holding cell, O'Malley caught a glimpse of himself in the station's security mirror. His reflection showed a man at peace, even as Reynolds gave him a final shove through the cell door. Enjoy your stay, Father, Morrison called out as they left. Maybe a night in here will teach you where a priest's priorities should be. The cell door clanged shut with finality, but O'Malley felt no fear. Instead, his fingers found the worn rosary in his pocket, the one item they'd allowed him to keep, dismissing it as harmless. They couldn't know that this simple string of beads would soon become their undoing. In the harsh, fluorescent light of the holding cell, Father O'Malley's rosary beads clicked softly against each other as they passed through his fingers. To the bored officer on duty, it looked like nothing more than a prisoner seeking comfort in prayer. But these particular beads, gifted to O'Malley upon his ordination 30 years ago, held a secret that would soon set extraordinary events in motion. The midnight shift brought Officer Reynolds to the desk, his conscience clearly troubled by the evening's events. He watched O'Malley through the security feed, the priest's calm presence making him increasingly uneasy. "Can I get you anything, Father?" Reynolds finally asked, approaching the cell. "Water, maybe?" O'Malley looked up from his prayers, his eyes carrying neither accusation nor fear. "Thank you, Officer Reynolds. Water would be appreciated." His fingers continued their steady movement over the beads, each click carrying purpose beyond mere devotion. Within the rosary's crucifix, hidden beneath decades of patina, rested technology far more sophisticated than its ancient appearance suggested. Each press of specific beads in sequence transmitted encrypted signals through a network known only to the highest levels of the Vatican's diplomatic corps. O'Malley had never needed to use this system before, but he understood its profound significance. As Reynolds returned with water, O'Malley completed another sequence. In a secure communication center thousands of miles away, monitors were already registering the distress signal from one of their own. "You know this isn't right," O'Malley said quietly to Reynolds, accepting the water. "Your discomfort shows. You still have a conscience." Reynolds shifted uncomfortably. "Just following orders, Father, nothing personal." "Orders that violate your oath to protect and serve are orders that should be questioned." O'Malley's words carried the weight of moral authority, but his tone remained gentle. "Your badge calls you to a higher standard." In the cell block's shadows, other detainees listened intently. They recognized O'Malley from his work at the community center, and his presence had created an unusual atmosphere of quiet dignity in the normally chaotic holding area. Meanwhile, in Vatican City, Cardinal Giuseppe Rossi was being awakened by an urgent message. The Cardinal, head of the Church's Office of Diplomatic Protection, recognized the emergency codes immediately. Within minutes, he had activated protocols that hadn't been used in decades. Back in the cell, O'Malley continued his seemingly endless prayer vigil. Each passing hour brought more unease to the officers on duty. Something about his unwavering serenity suggested strength rather than submission. "He's been at those prayers all night," Diaz muttered during a shift change. "Getting on my nerves." "Leave him be," Reynolds replied, his earlier bravado notably diminished. "We've got enough trouble without messing with a priest's prayers." What they couldn't see was the sophisticated network awakening across continents. Each click of O'Malley's rosary had transmitted not just his location and situation, but specific details about the officers involved. Their badge numbers gleaned from careful observation and the pattern of corruption he had documented over months. As dawn approached, Morrison returned to the precinct, his swagger intact, but his eyes betraying concern about potential repercussions. He found O'Malley exactly as they had left him, peaceful, focused, and somehow more imposing in his quiet dignity than any amount of physical intimidation could achieve. "Ready to reconsider your stance on those community complaints, Father?" Morrison asked through the cell bars, trying to maintain his air of authority. O'Malley looked up, his fingers still moving over the beads. "Every action has consequences, Sergeant, some more far-reaching than others." "Is that a threat?" Morrison's voice rose slightly. "No, Sergeant. Merely an observation about the nature of justice." O'Malley's calm reply carried no hint of the diplomatic storm that was already gathering force. As the first light of morning began to filter through the high windows of the holding area, O'Malley completed his final sequence of prayers. The rosary had served its purpose, transmitting every detail needed to set the Church's formidable diplomatic machinery in motion. Now it would revert to its sacred purpose, accompanying his genuine prayers for the reform of those who had imprisoned him. Cardinal Giuseppe Rossi stood at the window of his Vatican office, watching the pre-dawn light paint St. Peter's Square in shades of gold and purple. The encrypted diplomatic cable on his desk bore the highest priority markings, a designation he hadn't seen used in nearly a decade. "Attilio," he called to his secretary, "get me everything we have on the 43rd Precinct in America, particularly their leadership structure and any history of complaints, and contact our diplomatic liaison at the State Department immediately." The Cardinal's office quickly transformed into a command center as information began flowing in from multiple sources. Decades of diplomatic experience had taught Rossi that speed and precision were essential in these situations. The Church's power lay not in brute force, but in the careful application of influence through established channels. "Your Eminence," Attilio returned with a tablet displaying preliminary reports. "Father O'Malley's history is exemplary. 20 years of community service, multiple commendations from the Archbishop, and a spotless record of rehabilitation program success. The precinct, however," he paused, scrolling through darker statistics. "Show me," Rossi commanded, his lined face grave as he studied the pattern of buried complaints and suspicious internal affairs reports. "And the officers involved?" Sergeant James Morrison, officers Reynolds, Diaz, and Thompson. "Morrison has 7 complaints of excessive force in the past year alone, all mysteriously dismissed. The others follow a similar pattern." Rossi nodded slowly, decades of ecclesiastical diplomacy informing his next moves. "Contact Archbishop Sullivan immediately. He'll want to handle the local church response personally, then get me a secure line to the Apostolic Nuncio in Washington." The Cardinal's fingers traced the edge of a formal diplomatic protest document. As he dictated its contents, each word was carefully chosen, carrying the full weight of the Vatican's diplomatic authority, while leaving room for the escalation he suspected would be necessary. "Your Eminence," Attilio interrupted, "the State Department liaison is on the secure line." Rossi lifted the phone, his Italian accent precise and cultured. "Mr. Harrison, thank you for taking my call at this early hour. We have a situation requiring immediate attention." He paused, listening to the American diplomat's response. "Yes, it does involve one of our priests." "No, this will not be handled through regular channels. The Vatican is taking a direct interest." Across the Atlantic, the machinery of international diplomacy began to move. The Apostolic Nuncio's office in Washington received its instructions and began activating its own network of connections. Phones rang in congressional offices, State Department corridors, and police oversight committees. "The local police chief needs to understand the gravity of this situation," Rossi continued, his voice carrying the quiet authority of centuries of church power. "We expect Father O'Malley's immediate release and a full investigation into the precinct's practices." As the Cardinal coordinated the Vatican's response, he reflected on the significance of O'Malley's emergency signal. The hidden communication system in the rosary beads was reserved for the most serious situations. Its activation alone indicated a grave breach of trust between church and state authorities. "Attilio, prepare my travel documents," Rossi decided, watching the sun rise fully over St. Peter's Dome. "This situation requires a personal touch. Have the nuncio arrange meetings with the police commissioner, the mayor, and the district attorney. I want the full weight of our diplomatic presence felt before I arrive." The secretary nodded, already making arrangements. Both men understood that Cardinal Rossi's personal involvement would send an unmistakable message about the Church's commitment to this case. "And Attilio," Rossi added, lifting the diplomatic protest document, "ensure this reaches every relevant authority within the hour. It's time to remind certain officials that the Church's influence extends far beyond Sunday mornings." As morning fully dawned over Vatican City, the Cardinal's office hummed with purposeful activity. In a holding cell across the ocean, Father O'Malley continued his prayers, unaware of the diplomatic storm gathering force on his behalf. The officers who had thought to teach him a lesson were about to learn one of their own about the reach of ecclesiastical power in the modern world. Police Commissioner Rachel Chen was enjoying her first cup of morning coffee when her office phone lit up with calls from 4 different lines simultaneously. Her secretary's voice crackled through the intercom with barely contained urgency. "Commissioner, I have the mayor's office, the State Department, the Archbishop's office, and—" She paused, double-checking her notes. "The Vatican's Apostolic Nuncio, all requesting immediate conversations regarding an incident at the 43rd Precinct." Chen's coffee cup froze halfway to her lips. In 20 years of law enforcement, she'd never received this particular combination of high-level attention. "Start with the State Department," she directed, already pulling up the overnight arrest reports on her computer. "Commissioner Chen." The diplomatic voice on the line was coolly professional. "We're calling regarding a potentially serious international incident involving the wrongful arrest of a Vatican official." As the State Department representative outlined the situation, Chen's expression darkened. The 43rd Precinct had been a source of growing concern, but Morrison's arrest of Father O'Malley represented an escalation she hadn't anticipated. "I understand the severity," Chen responded, scanning O'Malley's arrest report. The charges were obviously fabricated: conspiracy and resisting arrest, with no supporting evidence. "I'll handle this personally." Before she could even end the call, her secretary announced another urgent message, this time a formal diplomatic protest delivered by Vatican courier. The document's official seals and carefully worded demands made it clear this situation wouldn't be resolved with the usual internal affairs investigation. Across town, Sergeant Morrison was just arriving for his morning shift when his phone buzzed with a text from a contact in the commissioner's office. "Vatican involved. Major heat coming down. What did you do?" Morrison's face paled as he read the message. He'd dealt with complaints before, buried investigations, and managed to keep his team protected, but international diplomatic pressure, that was beyond his experience. "Reynolds!" he barked, striding into the precinct. "Get in here, now!" Before Reynolds could respond, the precinct captain emerged from his office, face ashen. "Morrison, my office, immediately." The captain's voice carried none of its usual deference to his formerly untouchable sergeant. In the holding cell, Father O'Malley had finally ended his night-long vigil with the rosary beads. The morning shift officers treated him with noticeably more respect, their earlier bravado replaced by uncertain glances and whispered conversations. Meanwhile, Archbishop Sullivan was holding an emergency meeting with his staff, coordinating with Vatican officials and preparing for Cardinal Rossi's arrival. The Archbishop's secretary worked rapidly to compile a comprehensive file on Morrison and his team. Every complaint, every buried investigation, every community concern that O'Malley had documented over the years. "Make sure the Cardinal has everything," Sullivan instructed. "This ends now." Back at police headquarters, Commissioner Chen was reviewing the security footage from O'Malley's arrest, her jaw tightening at the obvious abuse of power. The Vatican's diplomatic protest sat on her desk, its demands clear and non-negotiable. Immediate release of Father O'Malley, full investigation of the 43rd Precinct, suspension of all officers, involved pending review. Complete access to all relevant records and personnel. A knock at her door interrupted her thoughts. "Commissioner," her secretary announced, "the mayor is here personally." The mayor's arrival confirmed what Chen already knew. This had escalated beyond a simple case of police misconduct. The political machinery of the city was about to clash with the diplomatic power of the Catholic Church, and Morrison's team had placed themselves squarely in the crosshairs. "Rachel," the mayor began, closing the door, "tell me how we're going to handle this before it becomes an international incident." "It already is an international incident," Chen replied, pushing the Vatican's protest across her desk. "And handling It means cleaning house at the 43rd. No more buried complaints, no more looking the other way. As they discussed strategy, Morrison sat in his captain's office, watching his carefully constructed world begin to crumble. The captain read from an official notice, outlining the terms of his immediate suspension pending investigation. "Your badge and gun," the captain demanded, no longer the compliant administrator who had helped bury so many complaints. For the first time in his career, Morrison felt the cold touch of genuine fear. The system he had manipulated for so long was turning against him, driven by forces far beyond his control or understanding. Morrison sat in his apartment, surrounded by hastily gathered files and his personal laptop. His hands shook slightly as he typed out revised versions of the arrest reports from the previous night. The false narrative needed to be perfect. No contradictions, no loose ends. "Delete everything," he barked into his phone. "Every email, every text about O'Malley or the community center. And get over here. We need to coordinate our stories." One by one his team arrived, their usual confidence shattered by the morning's events. Thompson paced nervously, while Diaz sat stone-faced on Morrison's couch. Reynolds was the last to show, his complexion ashen. "They're saying it's gone federal," Reynolds reported, closing the apartment door. "FBI's been called in to oversee the investigation. Something about civil rights violations under color of authority." Morrison's fingers froze over his keyboard. "Federal? That's impossible. We haven't even had a hearing yet." "Vatican's pushing it," Diaz added, scrolling through his phone. "Local. News is already picking up the story. Social media's blowing up with pictures of O'Malley's booking photo." "The booking photo," Morrison cursed under his breath. He'd been so focused on paperwork that he'd forgotten about the visual evidence. The image of O'Malley's calm dignity, despite his rough handling, was already becoming a symbol of police overreach. "Look, we stick to the story," Morrison insisted, his voice strained. "O'Malley was interfering with police business, showing hostile behavior. We had reasonable suspicion of criminal activity based on his association with known felons." "Reasonable suspicion?" Reynolds exploded, his nerve finally breaking. "He runs a church rehabilitation program. Everyone knows that. We've got nothing and you know it." "Keep your voice down," Thompson hissed, drawing the blinds. "The whole department's looking for someone to throw under the bus. We can't turn on each other now." Back at the precinct, internal affairs investigators were already setting up shop in a commandeered conference room. Detective Sarah Chen, no relation to the commissioner, laid out her carefully assembled file of complaints against Morrison's team. 3 years of data, she explained to her superior. Pattern of escalating abuse, systematic burial of complaints, consistent targeting of community programs. She pointed to a timeline on the wall. O'Malley's arrest wasn't an isolated incident. It was the inevitable result of unchecked corruption. In the break room, other officers whispered among themselves, picking sides in the coming storm. Some defended Morrison's old-school methods, while others expressed relief that the system was finally addressing long-ignored problems. "Did you see the commissioner's face when she reviewed the body cam footage?" One rookie whispered. "Never seen her that angry." "Morrison's done," another replied. "Question is, how many others is he taking down with him?" The precinct captain, feeling the pressure from above, began distancing himself from his former favorite sergeant. He provided internal affairs with full access to personnel files, including documentation of disciplinary actions he had previously downsized or dismissed. "I was just following departmental procedures," he insisted to the investigators, his earlier confidence replaced by bureaucratic self-preservation. Morrison's attempt at a cover-up was already unraveling. The falsified arrest report conflicted with body camera footage that officers had been required to wear but rarely activated. This time, however, multiple cameras had captured the incident from various angles, preserved automatically on cloud servers beyond Morrison's reach. "We need to get our stories straight about the community center," Morrison insisted, still trying to maintain control over his increasingly panicked team. If we all stick together, it's too late for that, Reynolds interrupted, heading for the door. I'm calling my union rep, Ann Morrison. You're on your own. As Reynolds left, the remaining officers exchanged uncertain glances. Their brotherhood of corruption was crumbling in the face of international scrutiny and internal investigation. Years of unchecked power were giving way to the cold reality of accountability. Morrison watched his team's unity dissolve, the weight of his actions finally settling on his shoulders. Outside his apartment, media vans were already gathering, their satellite dishes raised like accusatory fingers pointing toward his window. Cardinal Rossi's private jet touched down at the city airport just as the afternoon sun began its descent. Unlike the usual pomp that accompanied Vatican officials, his arrival was marked by quiet efficiency. A diplomatic vehicle with Vatican plates waited on the tarmac, its driver holding a leather portfolio containing updated reports on the situation. "Your Eminence," the driver greeted him, "Archbishop Sullivan is waiting at the Chancery. The police commissioner has agreed to meet with you in 1 hour." Rossi nodded, his crimson zucchetto catching the sunlight as he ducked into the car. During the drive, he reviewed the latest developments. Father O'Malley remained in custody. Though his treatment had improved dramatically, the corrupt officers were scrambling, making predictable mistakes in their panic. At police headquarters, Commissioner Chen paced her office, preparing for the meeting. The Vatican's diplomatic credentials lay on her desk, a reminder that this was no ordinary internal affairs matter. Her phone hadn't stopped ringing since morning, with calls from the governor's office, Justice Department officials, and media outlets, all demanding updates. "Cardinal Rossi has arrived," her secretary announced through the intercom. "He's in the lobby with his diplomatic team." Chen straightened her uniform and took a deep breath. In 25 years of law enforcement, she'd faced down gang leaders, corrupt politicians, and armed suspects. Yet something about the quiet authority of the approaching cardinal made her unusually nervous. The cardinal entered her office with minimal ceremony, his presence filling the room without any need for theatrics. Behind him, 2 Vatican lawyers carried briefcases bearing diplomatic seals. "Commissioner Chen," Rossi began, his accent refined but clear, "I trust you understand why the Holy See takes such interest in this matter." "Your Eminence," Chen replied, gesturing to the conference table, "I assure you we're taking this situation very seriously. Seriously enough to allow Father O'Malley to remain in custody for nearly 24 hours on obviously fabricated charges." Rossi's tone was mild, but his words carried steel. One of his lawyers silently opened a briefcase, removing a thick folder of documents. "These are copies of every complaint filed against Sergeant Morrison and his team over the past 3 years, the Cardinal continued. "Each one meticulously documented by Father O'Malley and forwarded to church authorities after your department buried them. The pattern is troubling." Chen's face tightened. "We're conducting a full investigation." "No, Commissioner," Rossi interrupted gently. "We are conducting a full investigation. The Vatican's diplomatic office has already been in contact with the Justice Department's Civil Rights Division. We've also prepared a comprehensive report for the United Nations Human Rights Council regarding systematic police abuse in your jurisdiction." He placed his papal diplomatic credential on the table, a simple document that represented centuries of international authority. "The Holy See is prepared to make this a major diplomatic incident unless immediate action is taken." Chen felt the ground shifting beneath her feet. This wasn't just about one wrongful arrest anymore. The Vatican was prepared to shine an international spotlight on years of institutional failure. "What are your demands?" she asked, her voice carefully controlled. Rossi smiled slightly, not in triumph, but in appreciation of her directness. "First, Father O'Malley's immediate release and public apology. Second, the termination of all officers involved in his arrest. Third, a complete external review of your department's complaint investigation procedures. Fourth, implementation of a community oversight board with real authority. That's beyond my authority, Chen protested. The police union will be dealing with the combined pressure of the Vatican diplomatic corps, federal civil rights investigators, and international media attention. Rossi completed her sentence. The choice is yours, Commissioner. Handle this internally or watch it. Become a global embarrassment for your city. As if on cue, one of his lawyers opened a laptop, displaying live news coverage. The story was already trending nationally, with O'Malley's booking photo becoming a symbol of police overreach and abuse of power. You have 1 hour to release Father O'Malley, Rossi concluded, rising smoothly from his chair. After that, I'm afraid matters will escalate beyond your control. He paused at the door, his final words carrying the weight of 2 millennia of church authority. The Vatican has a long memory, Commissioner. Let's resolve this before it becomes truly memorable. Officer Reynolds sat in his union representative's office, hands clasped tightly in his lap. 20 minutes ago, he'd made the decision that would end his career, but might save his freedom. Now he waited as the rep read through his written statement, each page adding another nail to Morrison's coffin. This is comprehensive, the union rep said finally, looking up from the document. Dates, times, specific incidents. You kept records? Started about 6 months ago, Reynolds admitted. When things began getting worse, Morrison was out of control, but none of us felt we could stop him. He pulled out his personal phone, scrolling through a hidden folder. I've got photos too. Evidence that was supposed to be lost. Documents that were meant to be shredded. Across town, in the Internal Affairs conference room, Detective Sarah Chen was interviewing Officer Diaz. Unlike Reynolds, he hadn't come voluntarily. But the pressure was starting to show. Look at these photos. Chen spread out a series of booking shots on the table, every one of these suspects showing injuries, every complaint buried, every investigation stonewalled, and now a priest with diplomatic immunity. You really want to go down with Morrison on this? Diaz's facade cracked slightly. You don't understand. Morrison has connections. He protected us, made sure we got the good assignments, the overtime. We just followed his lead. Those connections are gone. Chen pushed a newspaper across the table. The headline screamed about international outcry and Vatican intervention. Morrison can't protect anyone anymore, but maybe you can protect yourself. In the precinct locker room, younger officers who had once idolized Morrison's team now whispered about coming forward with their own stories. Years of witnessed abuse and enforced silence were bubbling to the surface. Remember that raid on the community center last spring? One officer murmured to Internal Affairs. Morrison claimed he had reliable intel about drug deals. But it was just harassment, trying to shut down O'Malley's rehabilitation program. I've got the real surveillance reports to prove it. The precinct captain, seeing which way the wind was blowing, had already provided a sworn statement distancing himself from Morrison's actions. His administrative assistant worked late into the evening, copying years of buried memos and complaints. I was just following orders, the captain insisted to investigators. Morrison had support from higher up. I couldn't intervene. His voice carried the desperate tone of a man trying to save his pension. Thompson, the last loyal member of Morrison's team, finally broke under the mounting pressure. His anonymous letter to Internal Affairs detailed years of systematic abuse, falsified reports, and witness intimidation. The night we arrested Father O'Malley, Thompson's letter concluded, wasn't an isolated incident. It was business as usual, just the wrong target. Morrison always said no one would believe the complaints of criminals and addicts over police officers, but he never counted on taking on the Vatican. Commissioner Chen read each new statement as it crossed her desk, the full scope of corruption becoming clearer with each revelation. What had begun as an investigation into a single wrongful arrest was exposing years of institutional failure. Get me everything, she ordered her staff. Every complaint, every buried report, every witness statement. If we're going to clean house, we're going to do it thoroughly. In the Internal Affairs Office Detective Chen added another string of red thread to her evidence board, connecting Morrison to dozens of incidents. The pattern was undeniable now, supported by multiple officers' testimonies. "It's not just Morrison," she explained to her superiors. "It's the whole system that protected him. The way complaints disappeared, the witnesses who were intimidated, the evidence that conveniently vanished. We're looking at departmental corruption on a scale that's going to take years to fully address." Reynolds, leaving the union office with his damning statement signed and notarized, felt a strange mix of relief and dread. His career in law enforcement was over, but for the first time in years, he could look at himself in the mirror without shame. "One more thing," he told Detective Chen, pulling out his phone one last time. "You should hear the recording of what Morrison said after we put O'Malley in the cell. That's when he showed who he really was." The precinct's security technician worked through his lunch break, methodically downloading footage from every camera that had captured Father O'Malley's arrest. His hands moved quickly over the keyboard. Driven by both professional duty and personal guilt, he'd helped Morrison lose footage before, but not this time. "You need to see this," he called to Detective Chen, who had been reviewing Reynolds' audio recordings. "Multiple angles, perfect clarity. Morrison didn't know about the new backup system we installed last month. On the main monitor, the footage played in devastating detail. The deliberate intimidation, the excessive force, the clear abuse of power, all captured in high definition from 3 different angles. The audio was even clearer than Reynolds' phone recording, picking up every threat, every mocking comment. "Send copies to my secure server," Chen ordered, already thinking ahead. "And get me the footage from inside the precinct too. I want to see everything from booking to the holding cell." The evidence room supervisor, another long-time Morrison enabler, had already cracked under pressure. She provided internal affairs with a detailed log of evidence that had been tampered with or disappeared over the years, including documentation from O'Malley's community center that Morrison had confiscated and supposedly lost. "The priest kept better records than we did," she admitted, pushing a box of recovered files across her desk. "Every interaction with Morrison's team, every complaint from program participants, every instance of harassment, all meticulously documented and time-stamped." In the commissioner's office, the security footage played on a large screen for Cardinal Rossi and his legal team. The cardinal's expression remained impassive, but his knuckles whitened slightly as he gripped his chair's armrests. "The audio is particularly illuminating," one of the Vatican lawyers noted, making timestamps in his notebook. "The officers' comments about the church's authority, their mockery of Father O'Malley's position, clear evidence of both civil rights violations and religious discrimination." Commissioner Chen nodded grimly. "We've also recovered years of buried evidence. Morrison's team had a systematic program of intimidation targeting the church's rehabilitation efforts. They saw Father O'Malley's work as a threat to their control of the precinct." The footage shifted to the holding cell area. The camera had captured Morrison's late-night visit to O'Malley, his attempts at intimidation contrasting sharply with the priest's calm dignity. The audio picked up every word with perfect clarity. "That's when he made his biggest mistake," Chen commented, pausing the playback. "Threatening a Vatican official on camera, explicitly stating his intent to interfere with church activities. The FBI's Civil Rights Division is particularly interested in that segment." Cardinal Rossi leaned forward, studying the frozen image. "And the other officers? The ones who've come forward?" "Rolling over on each other like dominoes," Chen replied. "Reynolds' testimony opened the floodgates. We've got written statements, audio recordings, even personal photos they took as insurance against Morrison. The whole corrupt system is exposed." The Cardinal's lawyer pulled out another document, a comprehensive timeline correlating the recovered evidence with years of buried complaints. Each incident was now supported by multiple sources of proof, creating an ironclad case against Morrison and his enablers. The community center's security cameras caught something else, the technician announced from the doorway, tablet in hand. Footage from the weeks before the arrest. Morrison's team conducting illegal surveillance, harassing program participants, destroying property, all dated and time-stamped. The final piece fell into place when Thompson surrendered his personal laptop, containing years of emails and text, messages that Morrison had ordered deleted. The department's tech team recovered everything, including conversations about targeting O'Malley and deliberate efforts to undermine the church's community programs. "It's all here," Detective Chen told her superiors, gesturing to the evidence wall that now stretched across 2 rooms. Every abuse, every cover-up, every act of corruption. Morrison didn't just make a mistake arresting Father O'Malley. He exposed years of systematic misconduct that we can now prove beyond any doubt. The State Department's diplomatic reception room buzzed with unusual tension. Assistant Secretary Harrison had cleared his afternoon schedule the moment the Vatican's formal diplomatic note arrived. Now, he sat across from Cardinal Rossi, acutely aware that this local police matter had evolved into an international incident. "The Holy See's position is non-negotiable," Rossi stated, his diplomatic credentials prominently displayed on the polished conference table. "We expect full federal intervention and oversight of the investigation. The pattern of religious discrimination and civil rights violations cannot be ignored." Harrison nodded gravely, scanning the latest briefing from his staff. The evidence was overwhelming: systematic harassment of church programs, deliberate targeting of religious activities, and now the wrongful arrest of a Vatican-credentialed priest. "We've already instructed the Justice Department to take over the investigation," Harrison assured the Cardinal. "The FBI's Civil Rights Division is assembling a task force as we speak." "That's a start," Rossi acknowledged, "but the Vatican requires more. This goes beyond a single incident of misconduct. We're looking at years of orchestrated attempts to undermine the Church's community outreach programs." The Assistant Secretary's phone buzzed with an urgent message. The story had exploded across international media. European news outlets were running special reports on American police corruption, while Vatican radio broadcast continuous updates to a global Catholic audience. "Your Eminence," Harrison chose his words carefully, "I want to assure you that the State Department takes this matter extremely seriously. We're prepared to issue a formal advisory to all law enforcement agencies regarding interaction with church officials and programs." Rossi's slight smile carried centuries of ecclesiastical diplomacy. "That would be appreciated, though I should mention that the Vatican's United Nations delegation is prepared to raise this issue before the Human Rights Council next week. We would, of course, prefer to resolve this through direct channels." The implicit threat hung in the air. A UN investigation would be politically disastrous, especially with the evidence already gathered. Harrison's colleagues at the UN mission had warned him about the growing international interest in the case. "We've drafted new protocols for police interaction with religious organizations," Harrison offered, sliding a document across the table. "We'd welcome the Vatican's input before implementation." In the adjacent room, State Department lawyers huddled with Justice Department officials, reviewing the case files. The evidence painted a damning picture, not just of Morrison's team, but of systematic failure at multiple levels of law enforcement. "The international implications are serious," one legal advisor warned. "Every Catholic country is watching this case. The diplomatic repercussions of mishandling it could be severe." Cardinal Rossi's phone chimed softly, a message from Rome. The Pope himself had been briefed on the situation and had authorized additional diplomatic measures if necessary. The Vatican's response would be measured but inexorable. "Mr. Harrison," Rossi said finally, "perhaps you should see this." He opened his briefcase, removing a thick folder. our complete documentation of similar incidents across the country. Father O'Malley's case is merely the most recent example of a disturbing trend. Harrison's face tightened as he reviewed the contents. The Vatican's diplomatic corps had been quietly building this file for years, waiting for the right moment to address the broader issue of police interference with religious outreach programs. "Your Eminence," Harrison replied, reaching for his secure phone, "I believe it's time I briefed the Secretary directly. This situation clearly requires attention at the highest levels." As Cardinal Rossi left the State Department, reporters clustered at the gates. The Vatican's diplomatic pressure had transformed a local police scandal into an international story about religious freedom and civil rights in America. Back in Rome, the Vatican's diplomatic machinery continued its relentless advance. Nuncios in capitals worldwide had been instructed to brief their host governments. The message was clear: the Church would employ its full diplomatic weight to ensure justice was served. Dawn broke over the city as FBI agents surrounded Morrison's apartment building. The task force commander checked his watch. 6 a.m. exactly. Perfect timing for what the media would later call Blue Wednesday, the day of reckoning for the 43rd Precinct. "James Morrison!" The agent's voice boomed through the door. "FBI! We have a federal warrant for your arrest." Inside, Morrison scrambled to delete files from his laptop, but it was too late. The door burst open, and agents swarmed his apartment. As they secured him, he caught a glimpse of his reflection in the television screen. Former Sergeant Morrison, now just another suspect in handcuffs. Across the city, similar scenes played out. Officer Thompson was arrested at his girlfriend's house, trying to flush his burner phone down the toilet. Diaz surrendered quietly at his mother's home. His bravado finally shattered. Only Reynolds avoided the morning raids, already in protective custody after turning state's evidence. The precinct fell into chaos as news of the arrests spread. Officers who had once feared Morrison now watched FBI evidence teams cart away boxes of files and computers. The captain, stripped of his command, sat stone-faced in his office as federal agents catalogued years of compromised evidence. "This is unprecedented," Commissioner Chen told the hastily assembled press conference, "based on evidence uncovered. During our investigation, the department has requested federal oversight of a complete reorganization. Effective immediately, the 43rd Precinct will operate under direct supervision of the FBI's Civil Rights Division." Cardinal Rossi watched the arrests unfold from the Archbishop's residence, his expression grave but satisfied. The Church did not seek vengeance, he told reporters, only justice and reformation. Sometimes those require difficult measures. In the federal courthouse, Morrison and his officers faced the judge for their initial appearance. The charges were devastating: civil rights violations, conspiracy, witness tampering, evidence destruction, and religious discrimination under color of law. "Your Honor," the federal prosecutor addressed the court, "the government has overwhelming evidence of systematic corruption spanning years. We request the defendants be held without bail, given their demonstrated ability to intimidate witnesses and destroy evidence." Morrison's attorney tried to argue for leniency, but the judge had already reviewed the preliminary evidence. "Mr. Morrison," she declared, "your actions represent a profound betrayal of public trust. Bail denied." Back at the precinct, interim commanders from other districts arrived to restore order. Young officers who had served under Morrison's corrupt regime found themselves being interviewed by internal affairs, forced to confront their own complicity in years of abuse. "We should have spoken up sooner," one rookie confessed to investigators. "We saw what was happening, but Morrison seemed untouchable. Now look at him, taken down by the priest he thought was powerless." Commissioner Chen spent the afternoon meeting with community leaders, including Father O'Malley, who had been released with a formal apology. The priest's calm demeanor belied the significance of the changes his arrest had triggered. "The department will be instituting mandatory cultural sensitivity training," Chen announced. with special emphasis on respecting religious organizations and their community programs. Father O'Malley has agreed to assist in developing this curriculum. As night fell, the federal investigation continued to expand. Morrison's network of corruption reached deeper than anyone had suspected, implicating officers in other precincts and officials in city government. The FBI task force commander ordered additional teams deployed. "This isn't just about cleaning up one precinct anymore," he told his superiors. "We're looking at systematic failure across multiple jurisdictions." Morrison's arrest was just the beginning. In his holding cell, Morrison finally grasped the magnitude of his fall. The power he had wielded so carelessly had evaporated, replaced by the cold reality of federal prison walls looming in his future. The priest he had dismissed, as weak, had proved to be his undoing, backed by an authority far greater than any police badge. Father O'Malley stood at the podium in St. Augustine's Church, facing a sea of reporters and community members. His first public statement since the arrests had drawn national attention, but his message would surprise many. "Vengeance is not our way," he began, his voice carrying clearly through the ancient stone church. "What happened in the 43rd Precinct represents not just the failure of a few officers, but a system that lost its way. Our response must not be celebration of their downfall, but commitment to healing and reform." In the front pew, Cardinal Rossi watched with quiet approval. O'Malley's humility and victory reflected the Church's highest principles. Behind him, former participants of the rehabilitation program filled the pews, living testimony to the power of redemption. "I've spent 20 years teaching that everyone deserves a second chance," O'Malley continued. "That includes police officers who have lost their way. The path forward isn't through punishment alone, but through understanding and reform." He opened his worn journal, now a crucial piece of evidence in the federal investigation. These pages document not just abuse, but missed opportunities for dialogue. Each complaint could have been a chance for understanding. Each confrontation could have been a moment of connection. The assembled media grew silent as O'Malley described his night in custody. Not the discomfort or humiliation, but the prayers he had offered for Morrison and his team. The way he had seen fear beneath their cruelty, insecurity behind their power. "They thought authority came from force," he explained, "when true authority comes from service. They believed power meant freedom from accountability, when real power lies in accepting responsibility for our actions." In the back of the church, several young officers from the precinct shifted uncomfortably. They had come expecting condemnation, but found something more challenging, a call to personal transformation. To those officers still serving in the 43rd Precinct, O'Malley addressed them directly. "Your community needs you now more than ever, not as enforcers, but as guardians, not as warriors, but as peacekeepers. The path to rebuilding trust begins with humility." Commissioner Chen, seated with other city officials, nodded slowly. O'Malley's words offered a blueprint not just for police reform, but for community healing. His rehabilitation program had always emphasized responsibility alongside forgiveness. "Even now I believe in redemption," O'Malley concluded. "Mr. Morrison and his team will face justice for their actions, but our response must be guided by mercy. Their fall from power should teach us about the responsibilities of authority, not the pleasures of revenge." As the press conference ended, O'Malley met privately with families who had suffered under Morrison's regime. He listened to their pain, acknowledged their anger, but gently guided them toward healing rather than hatred. "The system will be reformed," he assured them, "but reform must begin in our hearts. We cannot build trust on a foundation of bitterness." Later that evening, in his small church office, O'Malley added a new entry to his journal. Not a record of corruption this time, but a prayer for transformation, for the police, for the community, and for those who had lost their way in the pursuit of power. "The greatest victory," he wrote, is not in bringing others low, but in lifting everyone toward their better nature. The 43rd Precinct's main conference room had been transformed into a command center for reform, where photos of old commanders once hung. New organizational charts mapped out the restructured chain of command. Commissioner Chen stood before a group of hand-picked reformers from other precincts, federal oversight officials, and community representatives. "Everything changes," she announced, distributing thick binders containing the new department mandates. From patrol protocols to complaint procedures, from evidence handling to community engagement. We're not just removing corrupt officers, we're dismantling the system that enabled them. The FBI task force commander highlighted key findings on the central display screen. Morrison's network had revealed vulnerabilities throughout the department's structure. Each weakness would be addressed systematically, with multiple layers of oversight and accountability. "No more buried complaints," he explained, pulling up the new digital tracking system. "Every citizen report, every use of force incident, every interaction gets logged and reviewed. Multiple eyes on everything, with direct links to federal monitoring." In the equipment room, technicians installed new body cameras with tamper-proof software and automatic upload protocols. No more convenient malfunctions, no more lost footage. Every officer's actions would be recorded and preserved on secure federal servers. "These aren't just cameras," the tech supervisor explained to uncertain officers. "They're your protection. Good cops doing their jobs right have nothing to fear from transparency." The precinct captain's office, once Morrison's power base, now housed a civilian oversight committee. Community leaders, including former victims of police abuse, would have direct input into department policies and procedures. "Your experience matters," Commissioner Chen told the committee members. "You've seen the worst of law enforcement. Now help us build something better." Father O'Malley's rehabilitation program became a model for a new police-community partnership initiative. Officers would serve mandatory rotations in community programs, learning to see their districts through different eyes. "Understanding comes before enforcement," the new training coordinator explained. "You can't protect a community you don't know." The changes weren't just structural. Every officer underwent intensive retraining, with special emphasis on de-escalation techniques and cultural sensitivity. The old warrior mentality was being replaced by a guardian ethic. "Your authority comes from the community's trust," instructors emphasized. That trust must be earned every day, through every interaction. Some veteran officers resisted the changes, clinging to old ways and attitudes. They found themselves increasingly isolated as younger officers embraced the new culture of accountability and service. "If you can't adapt," Chen told the holdouts bluntly, "there's no place for you in the new department." The physical precinct itself underwent transformation. Dark interview rooms were replaced with transparent meeting spaces. The imposing front desk gave way to a welcoming community resource center. Even the cells were modified to ensure constant monitoring and humane conditions. "The architecture of power is changing," observed one federal overseer. "These spaces shape behavior. Open design encourages open conduct." By month's end, the 43rd Precinct had become unrecognizable to those who had served under Morrison. Gone were the shadowy corners where abuse could flourish, the hidden files where complaints disappeared, the unwritten rules that protected corrupt officers. In their place stood a new model of policing, transparent, accountable, and rooted in community service. The transformation that began with one priest's wrongful arrest had sparked a reformation of the entire system. "This is just the beginning," Commissioner Chen told her command staff. "What we're building here will become a template for departments across the country. The old way of policing died with Morrison's arrest. The future starts now." St. Augustine's church basement had never been so full. Former addicts sat beside rookie officers, while community activists shared coffee with veteran cops. Father O'Malley moved among them, watching as decades of mistrust began to thaw in the warmth of genuine dialogue. "My brother was arrested by Morrison's team last year," a young woman told the group, her voice trembling. "He was just trying to get clean, but they treated him like a career criminal." She paused, looking directly at the officers present. "But last week, when he relapsed, 2 of you new officers got him to the hospital instead of jail. That's the difference we're seeing." The new precinct liaison officer, Sarah Martinez, nodded from her seat in the circle. "We're learning that every interaction is a chance to either build trust or break it. Morrison's way was about power. This is about service." O'Malley's reconciliation program had become the cornerstone of the department's community rebuilding efforts. 3 times a week, officers and residents met to share stories, address grievances, and forge new understanding. "Tell me about your family," O'Malley encouraged a veteran officer who had initially resisted the changes. "Help them see the person behind the badge." The officer spoke hesitantly at first, then with growing openness about his fears, his hopes for the community, the toll that years of adversarial policing had taken on his own humanity. Round the room, heads nodded in recognition of shared pain. In the precinct itself, the Community Resource Center buzzed with activity. Local organizations had set up information booths, while officers staffed help desks alongside civilian volunteers. The walls, once bare except for wanted posters, now displayed art from neighborhood schools and community centers. "This used to be a place people feared," O'Malley remarked to Commissioner Chen during her weekly visit. "Now it's becoming a place of hope." The commissioner watched a young officer helping an elderly resident fill out assistance forms. "Your influence has spread beyond the church, Father. These officers aren't just changing their procedures, they're changing their hearts." Outside, the neighborhood itself showed signs of transformation. Joint police community patrols walked the streets, building relationships block by block. The suspicious stares that once greeted officers were slowly being replaced by cautious waves, then genuine greetings. "Remember," O'Malley told each new group of officers joining the reconciliation program, "trust grows at the speed of vulnerability. Your willingness to acknowledge past wrongs, to listen without defensiveness, to share your own struggles, these are the seeds of real change." The program wasn't without challenges. Some community members remained skeptical, their wounds too deep for quick healing. Some officers struggled to embrace the new approach, finding it harder to confront past failures than to simply enforce laws. But O'Malley's patient persistence created space for genuine transformation. When a former Morrison supporter broke down during a session, describing his shame at having enabled abuse, the community's response of compassion rather than condemnation marked a turning point. "Healing happens both ways," O'Malley noted in his journal that evening. "Those who were hurt learn to trust again. Those who did harm learn to serve with humility. This is how communities rebuild." As twilight settled over the neighborhood, a small group lingered after the regular session. An elderly woman, who had once fled when police approached, now sat comfortably beside a young officer, sharing stories about the neighborhood's history. Their quiet laughter echoed through the church basement, a sound that would have been unimaginable just months before. "This is what justice looks like," O'Malley thought, watching them. Not just punishment of the guilty, but restoration of the broken, renewal of the spirit, redemption of the whole community. 8 months after Morrison's arrest, the 43rd Precinct had become a national model for police reform. News crews and law enforcement observers from across the country filled the halls, studying the transformation that had begun with one priest's wrongful arrest. Commissioner Chen led a delegation of police chiefs through the renovated building, pointing out the physical and procedural changes that reflected the department's new philosophy. "Every arrest, every complaint, every use of force incident gets 3 levels of review," she explained, demonstrating the new oversight system. "But the real change isn't in the procedures, it's in the culture. To illustrate her point, she directed their attention to the Community Resource Center, where Officer Martinez was working with a group of former gang members on job applications. The same young men who once would have been targets for Morrison's aggressive enforcement were now partners in community safety. "Last month, these guys helped us prevent a turf war," Martinez told the visitors. "They trust us enough now to share information, to work with us instead of against us." Father O'Malley's influence permeated every aspect of the transformed department. His principles of redemption and reconciliation had been woven into training protocols, patrol guidelines, and community engagement strategies. "We've seen a 40% drop in violent crime," the statistics officer reported during the monthly community meeting, "not through aggressive enforcement, but through partnership and prevention." The federal oversight team, preparing their progress report, noted the dramatic shifts in both numbers and attitudes. Use of force incidents had plummeted. Civilian complaints were down by 60%. More significantly, when complaints did arise, they were handled with transparency and genuine accountability. "The Morrison era feels like ancient history," one veteran officer commented during a training session. "We used to measure success by arrests and confrontations. Now we measure it by problems solved and relationships built." Even the physical atmosphere of the precinct had changed. The harsh fluorescent lighting had been replaced with natural illumination. Interview rooms featured comfortable furniture and recording equipment that protected both officers and civilians. The holding cells, while secure, maintained dignity for those temporarily detained. "What happened here wasn't just reform," Cardinal Rossi observed during a follow-up visit. "It was reformation, a fundamental change in how power and authority are understood and exercised." The Cardinal's words proved prophetic as other departments began adopting the 43rd's methods. The precinct had become a laboratory for a new kind of policing, one that balanced authority with accountability, enforcement with empathy. O'Malley's rehabilitation program had expanded, now operating in partnership with the department. Officers worked alongside counselors and social workers, addressing root causes rather than just symptoms of community problems. "We're not just enforcing laws," the new precinct captain explained to a citizen advisory board. "We're building a community where fewer laws need to be enforced." The transformation touched individual officers in profound ways. Those who had initially resisted the changes found themselves embracing the new approach, discovering that respect earned more cooperation than fear ever had. "I used to think Father O'Malley was naive," admitted one senior officer during a training session. "Now I understand he saw something we couldn't, the possibility of real change, not just in procedures, but in hearts." As evening fell over the precinct, Commissioner Chen watched a group of officers heading out for community patrol. They moved with confidence, but without arrogance, their presence bringing reassurance rather than fear to the neighborhoods they served. "This is what justice looks like," she thought, echoing O'Malley's words from months before. Not just the absence of corruption, but the presence of genuine service. 1 year to the day after Father O'Malley's arrest, St. Augustine's Church hosted a remarkable gathering. Police officers, community members, city officials, and Vatican representatives filled the pews to commemorate not just a transformation of a police department, but the renewal of an entire community's spirit. Cardinal Rossi, who had flown in specially for the occasion, stood at the pulpit beside O'Malley. "A year ago, an act of injustice brought us to a crossroads," he began. "Today, we celebrate how that moment of darkness led to unprecedented light." In the front row, Commissioner Chen sat next to Sarah Martinez, now promoted to Community Relations Captain. Behind them, reformed officers mingled with rehabilitation program graduates, their former divisions dissolved by months of shared effort and understanding. O'Malley's worn journal lay open on the altar, its pages a testament to both the darkness of the past and the promise of the future. This book began as a record of corruption, O'Malley told the assembled crowd. It has become a chronicle of redemption. The changes had spread far beyond the 43rd precinct. Departments across the country had adopted the St. Augustine model of police reform, combining rigorous oversight with community engagement and spiritual principles of redemption. Morrison's arrest made headlines. A national news correspondent noted in her anniversary coverage. But it was what followed, the patient, systematic transformation of police culture, that made history. Morrison himself, now serving his sentence in federal prison, had written a letter that O'Malley chose to share with the gathering. "I thought power came from causing fear," the former sergeant had written. "You showed me true power lies in creating hope." The ceremony included the inauguration of the O'Malley Institute for Police Community Relations, a joint venture between the department and the church. The institute would train officers from across the country in the principles that had transformed the 43rd. What happened here wasn't just about removing bad officers, Chen explained to the assembly. It was about reimagining what policing could be. Father O'Malley didn't just expose corruption, he showed us a better way. As evening approached, the formal ceremony gave way to a community celebration. Officers and residents shared meals, stories, and laughter in the church basement where so much healing had begun. O'Malley moved through the crowd, greeting old friends and new allies. He paused to watch a young officer playing basketball with teenage boys who a year ago would have seen any police presence as a threat. "The greatest victory," he remarked to Cardinal Rossi, "isn't in the systems we've changed, but in the relationships we've built." Rossi nodded, observing the easy interaction between police and community. "You turned an arrest into an awakening," he replied, "not through force, but through faith in the possibility of change." As the celebration wound down, O'Malley returned to his office. He opened his journal to a fresh page, reflecting on the year's journey. The words came easily, flowing from a heart full of gratitude. "A year ago, corrupt officers thought they could silence the truth through intimidation. They didn't understand that true authority comes not from force, but from service. Their attempt to demonstrate power revealed instead its proper use, not to dominate, but to protect, not to instill fear, but to nurture hope. Today, our community stands transformed, not because evil was defeated, but because good was given room to flourish. The badge and the collar now work together, each serving in their own way, both dedicated to the dignity of every soul. This is the miracle we celebrate, not just the end of corruption, but the beginning of communion. Where there was distrust, now there is dialogue. Where there was fear, now there is friendship. Where there was darkness, now there is dawn. Outside his window, the setting sun painted the precinct building in gentle light. The harsh fortress it had once been was now a beacon of hope, its doors open to the community it served. In this transformation, O'Malley saw the hand of divine providence, turning injustice into opportunity, converting corruption into redemption. The story of the 43rd Precinct would be told for years to come, not just as a tale of reform, but as a testament to the power of faith, forgiveness, and the unwavering belief that even in the darkest moments, light can prevail.